Good morning, and what on earth is happening in this country concerning our politics? It is difficult to remember a time when we've been more divided.
America is locked in battle.
A massive march spanning miles led by Black Lives Matter.
We started getting complaints from all across Metro Atlanta.
Today, anti-mask protesters yelled, played music, and brought signs.
We've done really an extraordinary job. We're going down, not up.
Fix the shortage of PPE for our healthcare workers before you tee off another round.
He's against God. He's against guns.
I'm worried about what he'll do in the next year in presidency.
Hey, I'm Amber. In this series, we'll be discussing the various reasons on why people don't vote. We hope that by the end of this, you'll not only have the tools, but the confidence that you'll need to use your voice to vote. In this day and age, I've been hearing a lot of different reasons on why our young people are so discouraged by our voting system. And so that's why I got together with some of my friends to talk about those issues, as well as discuss misconceptions and misinformation about the voting process. So let me introduce you to them.
Hi, I'm Whitney Mixter.
My name is Blair Imani.
Hi, my name is David Johns.
I'm Nik Dodani.
And this is Convince Me.
Some folks there claiming their votes are actually being suppressed.
Voters waiting to cast their ballots. The U.S. Surgeon General's advice to voters: don't forget your face masks.
I don't think it's the new machines. I do think that there is systematic disenfranchisement of specific communities.
This is just so wrong. This election should have been called off. You know, they're telling us to stay in the house and, stand 6 feet from each other. But then one of the most important times, they're forcing us to come out here in a group. Stop playing politics with our lives.
Hey, Blair, welcome to the conversation. Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, Amber. I really admire you for taking this initiative to make sure that folks get convinced that voting is important. My name is Blair Imani. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a Black, bisexual Muslim woman, historian. I'm a retired grassroots organizer, but I'm very familiar with Get Out the Vote campaigns and their shortcomings and how we need to improve and remix it. I'm the author of 2 historical books, one of which I'll probably be reading from today called Making Our Way Home, the other one, Modern History, right here. And yeah, I try to make sure that everybody can understand history. Most Americans read at a 5th grade level. Most magazines are written at a 5th grade level. So my books are written at a 5th grade level.
First of all, you just brought up a major point that I was making with other people that I was interviewing on the level of education that people have and how to break through. And a lot of times, a lot of the content that gives knowledge is either not for us or it's at a level that most don't understand. When I ask my audience why they have a hesitation on voting or why they haven't in the past, majority of the comments back to me were saying, oh, I just don't know what to do. I'm not knowledgeable on that. I don't feel confident in showing up, and because I don't even know who everyone is or what we're fighting for.
Absolutely. So I kind of feel like history is the solution to everything, but I also know I'm mega biased because I'm a historian, so I'm always going to say that. But the reason why we feel like we have to come at like this high education level to vote is because of things like literacy tests. The reason why we feel like we have to, be a certain type of way to be heard by society is because society tells us that at every different level. I want folks to understand that as Black folks in the United States, it's one thing to talk about places like Florida, which just restored the vote to people who had been previously incarcerated. Huge, important thing. But when we think about things like the abolition of slavery and indentured servitude in the United States through the 13th Amendment, the fact that that still exists as punishment for a crime. And the reality is that there are so many different places that participate in slave labor, that participate in indentured servitude, and it's constitutional, but it's not morally correct.
Poor communities have that lack of education because people don't realize that public schools are funded by property tax in the area. So then if you have a poorer community, obviously the property tax is much lower in that, and therefore the funding is not there for schools, and therefore they are underfunded. They are undersupplied. They don't have proper resources. They don't have, the proper support like counselors to be there for kids, or even applying after school programs or certain classes or books within the school to actually educate our youth on our politics and what they are and aren't able to do. So I wanted to kind of touch on that.
So no, I'm ready to go on that because
yes.
the thing is, in those same neighborhoods, in those same areas, there's plenty of money for a school police officer, but there's not enough money to make sure that the cafeteria is properly resourced, not enough money to make sure that there's clean water coming through the school. Right. There's not enough money to recognize that if somebody is having a crisis and it's showing up as them being disruptive, don't arrest that child. Get a school counselor in there. And it's so much more expensive, literally, to criminalize behavior. Not only is it more expensive, but sometimes people only care about money. It's just morally incorrect, you know, to turn this into like, oh, this is a criminal issue instead of a kid. Maybe that kid's parent is, you know, not absent because the kid's parent is bad, but because of capitalism, because they have to work 2 and 3 jobs to provide for these students. So it's about understanding where that comes from, absolutely, but then also recognizing that because of history, we are, you know, relegated to these areas. The fact that between 1934 and 1968, 98% of the home loans that were federally funded went to white families.
Right.
Black folks were applying for those loans left and right, but literally, my grandfather, Joe, he was a carpenter, and the only reason why he was able to purchase a house was because he went directly to the white land developer and said, can I just pay you directly because I can't get a loan, even though I'm a veteran too. Meanwhile, my white grandpa, Roy, he bought 2 houses in a period of 10 years because he was a white GI and he got federal assistance to do that. But when we talk about federal assistance today, it's turned into, you know, welfare queen. It's turned into people who are like sucking at the government's tea and like taking entitlements. When the fact is, we have been disadvantaged systematically, not just through slavery, but through the New Deal, even the coronavirus relief programs. Black businesses were the least likely to benefit along with women-owned businesses. And then, of course, Black women-owned businesses were the least likely to benefit from coronavirus relief. So it's really all of that. If we think about World War I, take it all the way back, you know, at the beginning of the century. Black Americans and Native Americans were called upon to fight in that war, but were not able to participate in the people, electing the people who had decisions about those wars. A lot of folks don't realize that it wasn't until 1924 through the Snyder Act that Native American folks, indigenous folks in the United States had citizenship. Like I said in the book, on paper, Black people possess the right to vote. However, a myriad of barriers like poll taxes, vigilantism, and literacy tests prevented the majority of the Black community from exercising that right. Mm-hmm. So this is something constant, right? There's the idea that you have a right, but how can you even like practice it if there's no practicality in getting to that point? Right. So poll taxes meant, and we can just kind of go one by one. Poll taxes meant that only people with the requisite finances could vote because the fee did not differ based on the individual's income. You know, there's this idea in America that unless you own some stuff, unless you make a certain amount of money, your voice shouldn't be heard. And that's a problem.
So if we have all these factors that, kind of hold them back and they're in this survival mode, it's hard for those people to think about something outside of their own bubble, right? So I wanted to bring up to you on how we reach those people. What can we better do as a society or people with a platform or just leaders in general in educating and reaching these people that feel this way or have had history in their family with voter suppression?
So that's the first thing. There's so many get out the vote programs that are just like, vote. Why aren't you guys voting? Or like they'll post something about Black Lives Matter and they'll say, so while you're in the street, just remember to vote. And it's like, okay, but if you're not paying attention to initiatives like LeBron James' recent collaboration with the organization name escapes me, but specifically looking at voter suppression and looking at folks like Stacey Abrams who are doing that, making sure that when ballot initiatives like restoring the vote to formerly incarcerated folks become on the ballot, that you're advocating about that too, because these are all interconnected. But it's also making sure that the school to prison pipeline isn't so harmful that we have these people who are just turning 18 in the prison system and have never had the opportunity to vote, who are disproportionately Black, Latino, Indigenous, etc., and then are denied those opportunities. One of the last things I wanted to talk about has to do with this idea of fraudulent voters and how, number 45 keeps saying mail-in ballots are going to make fraudulent problems, that we need to suppress voting. We need to make it harder to vote so that we can get the real and accurate head count. This isn't new. It's very much a conservative, not even conservative, even just a white supremacist talking point that we have to further, keep people from voting in order to get the real results. And that's not true, right? It's to get the results that the white supremacists want, because they know that if we are allowed to vote, they will no longer be in power.
One of the issues is that we have voter suppression, and that's a real thing. And on top of that, we have a lot of people in marginalized communities that don't use their vote because of their hesitance. So if we're trying to get them to realize that right now, more than ever, is a time that we need their voice and that it does matter. And we can go as far as doing our part to educate them. But then when they try to show up and they're in these long lines, or when they show up and they don't have the proper ID or whatever it is, we're combating that. And so in part of this movement, we need to explain to them why it's so crucial to have more polling places, why it's so crucial to update the systems and allow online voting, mail-in ballots, make it easier for people that can't show up. Maybe it's an elderly person that can't walk, or or just
a disabled person.
Weird. Yeah, or somebody that is nervous because we are in a pandemic still, right? We need to find other ways to allow people to use their voice, period.
We have young people who are progressive and who are able to vote, and the same people aren't going to be in power. So we really, really have to look at the insidiousness and look at everything that's at risk, while we also get those folks who have that access, who have a polling place that isn't open forever. And if you live in places like the suburbs, if you're not living in an environment where you have to be in close proximity to people, where you're able to vote in open air areas, I'm talking to you Californians, we both live in California, then it's going to be a different context for folks who literally are unable to. So be, a warrior, and when you vote, make sure that you understand what's up and down ballot. There are so many websites now. All it takes is a quick and simple Google search. I know it's hard to know what you're Googling. So when you start doing that, down ballot measures, type that in and look at all the things that are on the table. Because even if you don't like the presidential candidates we have, you're voting for DAs, you're voting for sheriffs, you're voting for so many different people who will affect the daily life consequences of what you're going through.
We need to make sure that the people that are making decisions for us represent us and our lives, our ideals, and the things that we need. And so thank you for saying that, because while we are talking about voting and pushing this for this presidential election, we can't forget the fact that there's all these other people that are so important to where we live in our daily lives, like you were saying, that we need to not only pay attention to, but make sure that we are supporting the person that will best represent us.
Even if somebody looks like you, it doesn't mean that they support everything that you're about. So you have to learn what they're about. The other thing is that once you vote for that person, the relationship doesn't stop there. These, public servants is what we call them, work for us. So if you're saying that, oh my goodness, like, my auntie Donna in Houston, she hates that she has to pay for a sticker to park on her own street. So I was telling her, like, you have the guy's poster on your lawn who goes to the same church as you. He's the reason why that it costs $200 a month or $200 a year for you to park on your own street. And She wasn't aware of that. So just because you're supporting somebody, it doesn't mean that it stops there. The transaction is not a voting, that person's elected, they do what they want. It's they carry out the representation of the people. That's what America was founded on, or at least it was supposed to be.
Thank you so much for this conversation, Blair. I'm just so happy to have you. You are somebody that I look up to a lot, especially to educate me further so that I can spread the right message and the right education to other people. So thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thank you. I look up to you as well, both in the metaphorical sense and in the literal sense, because you're tall as hell. But I want to say, at the end of this, if you take anything away from this, folks who are listening, who are, reading, etc., if you feel like your vote doesn't matter, that makes sense. Society makes us feel that way. If you feel like your vote isn't going to change anything, that's understandable too. However, if you have the ability to vote, not only is it your duty and is it a good thing to do, but you are standing up for folks who are going to be negatively impacted by the folks who become powerful, whether or not you do anything about it. So it's like that saying, like, one vote can definitely change an election, but your vote is crucial because it can materially change things in the United States as we fight for freedom, both on the streets, in these offices, etc. So stay aware of what's going on, vote, but that is not the end of the conversation.
In our democratic system, one person, one vote should be the norm. But in our country, that is not the case.
There have been acts against marginalized groups for hundreds of years, and that can still be seen today.
Voter suppression is one of the most prevalent forms of oppression against these communities.
By not educating people in these communities, we've been doing ourselves a disservice and stifling the inherent progress of our country.
We need to learn how to use our voices more effectively.
We need to invest in community accountability,
uplift each other,
validate and amplify each other's voices,
and realize that your voice does matter.
Hey, David. Thank you so much for being a part of this. I mean, you know how I feel about you, but you are a go-to voice for me and making sure that I have all the facts. I am up to date on what's going on and just what you represent and what you speak on. You're a mentor for me. I don't know if you know that. And I'm just so happy to have you talking about this subject that means so much to me. So thank you.
I love and respect you and am humbled by that. I did not know that.
Yeah, you do. So I'm going to start with telling you how when I became of age and realized that my voice does matter and that I started telling my college friends, like, hey, we got to get out here and we got to make our voice heard, especially for the Obama election. I started realizing that a lot of people weren't jumping at it like I was because of the fact that they didn't feel knowledgeable on it, so they didn't have the confidence, or they felt like it was a chore because in a lot of places, especially where I grew up, there was long lines, or they weren't able to use their student ID, and that was the only form of the ID that they had at the time. So that started really getting me to realize that there was issues here that need to be cleared up, and that people needed more information so they use their voice. And on top of that, there's so much information out there where people feel like their voice won't matter anyway. So I wanted to talk to you about that because I know that that's some of the things that you have been combating out there for us for years.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Interestingly enough, I remember voting pre-Obama, which is interesting because that's like a demarcation for a lot of folks, especially Black folks, about when they became politicized. And for me, I remember also having lots of conversations about the West Wing and like the political conversations that would often happen in DC and in spaces where people had access to that level of privilege. But for a lot of folks, for a lot of Black folks, for a lot of Black queer folks, for a lot of Black folks from the other side of the country, like from California, where I'm from, where you are now, where you, I know, spent some time growing up, being far away from what we see as the center of political power means that we are often removed. And so typically it is the case that every 4 years, there's this large campaign that's rolled out by a number of organizations and a couple of corporations that say, we have to vote. And usually they say we have to vote because if you're Black, people died for your right to vote. And what I remember about one of my earliest experiences voting was my Nana, my great-grandmother, who I was fortunate enough to spend a lot of time learning from and observing, talking about the importance of voting because white people didn't want me to. What she reminded me of, the history lessons that should have been taught in school, is that it wasn't until the 3/5 compromise, when only parts of Black people who were still, to be clear, at the point in which the compromise was enacted, were considered property, were counted for the political benefit of white people. And so for a lot of people who really understand the Black Lives Matter movement, who are risking their lives in this global pandemic to protest for radically inclusive social justice, you really understand the importance of voting because you understand that there are people who don't want us to vote and who actively, as you mentioned, Amber, try and prevent us from voting, right? The long lines at particular polling places, the inability to vote by mail, the inability to use particular forms of ID. Those are all decisions that have been made, some of them more recently than others, to prevent people, in particular young people and Black people, Latinx people, other racial ethnic minorities, LGBTQIA+ people, from being able to vote, in particular because we tend to vote for the types of leaders and issues that celebrate the beautiful diversity that has always existed in our community. And so it's incredibly important for us as an organization now to highlight for people the history of voting, in particular the history of white people trying to prevent Black people and Latinx people and non-Native people and queer people and people with disabilities from voting, and to ensure, especially again now in this global pandemic, that people are able to vote safely. And that if in fact they do vote, right, and during the long lines that you mentioned and that we've seen in a number of primary states or any of the other ways in which elections are stolen by people in positions of power, that their votes will be counted. And so for us, that's a lot of the work.
I keep running into this frustration that I have in my mind because I feel like we are just so behind with the system. Like, we update our phones so often, but then I feel like our technology is so behind as far as like government resources and websites and things like that. And, you know, I saw this meme recently that just made me think about this, that blows my mind. It's like, we can deposit a check on an app on our phone and do all these banking transactions, but we can't vote that way.
All of that stuff is by design. And there are three things that I think often about that exist in some forms in different countries, and that we all know, again, are possible based on where we are. One is automatic voter registration. There's no way, again, in the way that we now require folks to sign up for selective draft service when you get a driver's license, or invite people to register to become organ donors. There are processes that can be put in place when we do other things connected to our social existence, like signing up to drive, that would allow us to register to vote automatically, or just register people so that there's no need for them to do anything. That would mean that there are so many more people who are in a position to exercise their civic right, and would prevent so many people who otherwise want to vote from being prevented to vote. The second, very much related to this, is time off. If you are working in a gig economy, if you are working now, if you're a frontline worker who's not in a hospital, but a frontline worker because you don't have the choice or the luxury to be able to stay home, you likely will not be able to take off work if your employer does not give you that time. And so what that means, again, is that unless you have the financial privilege, then you are literally without the ability to cast your ballot or exercise your right to vote, what should be your right to vote. And so acknowledging that we have holidays and awareness days for everything, we should have a day where we observe the importance of our civic duty to participate in this process of having people who are elected and who understand that it is a privilege to serve their constituents, right? That is the work, and we should have a day that acknowledges that, including by allowing people to go vote without having to choose between that or being paid. And then the last thing, again, and I previewed this, is that people should be able to vote using a cell phone. I am clear that it is a tool of oppression to prevent certain communities from being able to vote, that we have not done this to date.
I mean, shouldn't that be common sense? I can't even believe we have to say that, especially being in 2020 and the fact that there's a COVID tracker on our phones.
And it might be common sense, but as my nana would say, like, everybody ain't common. And so what I think about is that the most recent example about how this is all about holding on to power and holding on to power in the opposition of the plurality of people is the question of DC statehood, right? Like, for the last at least 10 Congresses that I can think of, the question of whether or not DC should be a state, right? And by that we mean given the right to vote, they have representation in Congress, but it's rendered meaningless when the representative can't actually cast a vote. And so, as has become almost ceremonial at this point, there was a bill that was passed. It was taken up in the House of Representatives. They passed it with an overwhelming majority. And that was sort of deflated quickly. The celebration was sort of deflated quickly because Mitch McConnell, the leader in the Senate, again, this is the same person who was taking pictures in front of Confederate flags, who has argued in the Senate well against acknowledging the work of Dr. King. This is somebody who has stood with, he might not be a racist, but he definitely stood with racists over time, right? But this is someone who said recently that the only reason why they will not take up the question of DC statehood is because they don't want to provide space for more liberals, right? And often liberals in this context becomes code for how we racialize politics and talk about issues rather than people, right? What should be considered is that DC is incredibly diverse, right? And it is a reflection of the industries, the companies, the politics that make it what it is. Because those people tend to believe that public schools should be funded equitably and that trans people should have access to healthcare, that it's important to acknowledge that, like, Black Lives Matter, both with regard to symbols, but also with regard to substance. They should not be denied access to have their voices carried in the halls of Congress. And we should all be clear that the ability for Mitch McConnell and the United States Senate to hold off that possibility, to allow people to be taxed without representation, is simply about the preservation of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. However you feel about any of this, in particular, the voting system, the way that laws in this country have been built to preserve white supremacy and anti-Blackness, homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, transmisogynoir, and all of that is valid. It is valid. I want you to hit me when I acknowledge that it is valid. And I encourage you to tap into the frustration, anger, whatever feeling you have about like a system that is clearly unjust by design, and talk about it. Just talk about it. Use the platform that you have digitally to engage in conversations where you ask questions about how things have come to be, when you're in community with people safely, practicing social distancing. Ask them questions about their ideas, their experience with voting, and like how they've come into all of this. Just talk about it. The more that we have these kinds of conversations, the more that people will be invited into understanding that their voice matters, and that, again, these things are by design, and that we have the ability to change them. Again, it is sad that it's been made a choice in part by a lot of Republican governors and people responsible for decisions around voting in countries and states throughout this country. They force people to choose safety over voting. I want people to prioritize their safety. And so in some states that will mean voting by mail. You might not have done that. Know that there's data around the fact that that's safe. Again, we still have work to do in order to ensure that that's protected. And so folks don't try and steal stuff, but I want people to know that that's an option. There are also some states and municipalities that are trying things out, like having people pull up to a polling site and there will be a poll worker that will come out so you can vote by car. And so again, ask questions about what's possible so that you know, and you might be able to introduce the possibility that had not been considered heretofore. And so I want people to think about running for office, whether it's school board, DA, mayor, state representative, Congress. Run for it. Don't let your age, your whatever, just think about the fact that the current occupant of the Oval Office is beyond mediocre. And whatever fear you might have or thing that might creep into your mind around like stereotype threat or imposter syndrome, push it aside and think about if there's a public position that you could occupy and be a good steward in, run for it. And if there are ways that we can be helpful, let me know. If that's not your calling, because again, that's not for everyone, and I don't want to suggest that, find a way to hold people accountable. And one of the ways that we can hold people accountable is to vote. Not just every 4 years, but every chance we can vote as often as we possibly can. It's to, again, leverage platforms to call people out when they say, for example, as the chancellor of schools in New York did, that he cares about anti-racist teachings, but it's nothing about implicit bias, right? Like calling them out and inviting them in to do the work that they purport to care about is an incredibly important way to be involved if you decide that you cannot run. But again, I encourage people to think about running, because too often it's something that we think is only reserved for the privileged and white among us. But that's simply not true.
Holding your local, those people in those local positions accountable for what they're doing. And then on top of that, if you are understanding what is not happening for you, that will give you the overall picture of what needs to happen. And then when someone else comes up, maybe if you're not someone that wants to run, you can find that person that does represent your ideals and support them and support their election and, make your voice heard to, vote for them, but also to spread that new knowledge that you have. Because a lot of people don't have that privilege to take the time to pay attention to all the things that are going on within the city.
There are a lot of young people who think that we just arrived at where we are now, and it neglects the importance of appreciating that we only now have the ability to have public national conversations around divesting from city budgets and police departments who have been assumed to have the ability to respond to community needs that they haven't and that have been exacerbated as a result. That's because there have been folks like Andrea Ritchie calling for the abolishment of police and Angela Davis calling for abolishment of the prison industrial complex for decades. And there is something about this particular moment of this political, economic, social crises on top of and exacerbated by COVID that makes things feel different in terms of like what we then do. I think there are a number of things, and this is the beauty of living in this country that we live in, like you can get in where you fit in, right? And so There are a number of organizations, national and local, that have policy agendas that they are advancing at the municipal level, the state level, and the federal level. You can ask your elected official about them, where they are. You can hold them accountable in terms of your vote for them or support for their campaign. And that's the bill that was introduced by the Congressional Black Caucus that includes a range of things connected to the Black Lives Matter movement and the issues that have been included under that banner. And then most recently, the Movement for Black Lives issued a policy proposal of their own that I hope will be taken up and considered as a part of that CBC package. And so, the legislation that already exists is one place to focus. And some folks might say, like, the policy thing is not my game. Policy is a lagging indicator. There are ways that people now can leverage platforms like the one that you have, Amber, to help people make these critical connections, to have access to information so that they can be more engaged, right? Like in whatever way that means for them, often, I think, at home. And what I really am trying to say is that I want people to be aware of the fact that there have been organizations in our community and federally working in DC, particularly around these issues, are working for decades. And I don't want us to ignore their efforts or fail to learn from their labor as we continue to try and do more and push further faster. And so I want people to know that there's a foundation upon which we should be building. I also want people to know that more of us should be thinking about policy and policy entrepreneurship. I know a number of young people who think that I'm smart, I speak well, and I'm told the only way to make change is to go to law school or become an elected official. Those things are important, but there are other ways that you can enter into and influence the process. And so I want people to be mindful of that. So much of what we've talked about under the banner of voting or the kind of social justice that's connected to the movement for Black Lives or the Black Lives Matter movement or all Black Lives Matter movement, as I like to underscore, because they're members, as we've talked about, Amber, in our community in particular, who are often neglected and ignored in that space, right? Like the thing for that I want everybody to hear me say is that, like, there is a place for you in this work. There are no lay people in this. This is an all hands on deck enterprise. I want everybody to think about what they can do in the arena that feels good, that encourages them to be uncomfortable, which is also required, but that allows them to make a meaningful contribution to this incredibly important work. And if you have questions, they're valid. Please do the work of finding someone who can answer them for you. Our website is mbjc.org. There's lots of information, both about voting as well as about the census, that I hope will answer some of the questions that often come up. And if not, email us or tweet us or DM us and we'll help find the answer.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for adding in so much knowledge to this subject. And thank you for what you do for us and your continued fight and everything that you're providing for us to make this world better for us, especially this country. So I really appreciate you. Thank you for being with us.
Truly my pleasure. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brita Filter, and I am the co-chair of Drag Out the Vote. And today, I want to talk to you about something important. So, you're not registered to vote. Don't worry. I'm going to show you. The process is super quick and easy. You can Google how to vote to find a lot of organizations focused on mobilizing young, marginalized people to vote. All you need is the address you'll be voting from and your driver's license or state ID number. You can do it from your home or from your phone. If you're not sure what party you identify with, you can register as independent and still vote in the primary election in these states. If you want to figure out what party you align with, you can take this short quiz to find out where on the political spectrum you fall. It doesn't take much time, and taking this first step is the best motivator in becoming involved and exercising your voice about the issues you care about. Okay, now listen, honey, no one has all the answers right now, but as long as we commit to keeping up with what's happening in the world around us, we are going to have the knowledge to mobilize for change that we want to see in the future. Listen, I'm a vote, so you Brita vote. You get it? Because my name is Brita Filter. Go vote! Yeah! We got to change some shit up.
Thank you so much for being with us. I hope you guys learned that voting is key to making sure that our country serves us all. And by voting, we can make a huge impact locally and nationally. Make sure you guys stick around for the next episode. We're gonna tell you guys how to apply your vote, and we're gonna give you guys the functions of the government. I'll see you guys next time on Convince Me. Peace.